My children and I were placed in a hotel for over 6 months. 4 of us were crowded in one room with almost all our belongings. Life was a living hell. We had to queue for hours to use facilities. Sometimes people fought over facilities. There was a lot of violence, antisocial behaviour, drugs, verbal abuse, discrimination. We had to travel miles daily to take the children to school. For someone who fled domestic violence with 2 children and additional needs to end up in such a situation, it nearly broke me completely. It's worse than a nightmare. The house is almost 50 staircases without lifts, cockroaches, mice. I fell several times when I was pregnant. Leaking, damp, roof touching our heads, tiny rooms, we slept on the ground. We haven't had a working cooker for 4 years. The council knows this, but nothing's been done. And there's lots of disabled people that are warehoused in this building. Many don't have any properly adapted flats and they couldn't get out if there was a serious fire. It's riddled with mice, slugs and snails climbing the walls, it's filthy. Heating's not working properly, no hot water. Bin bags from previous residents in the yard. No one responded to our calls for weeks. Totally ashamed to live like this. My clearly disabled child was asked if they could sleep in a bunk bed on the top bunk. We were put up 2 flights of narrow stairs in a mouldy flat that had a door that wouldn't lock or close. It was out of area, so my youngest autistic child was forced to leave her primary school she grew up at and loved. I suffer with autism, and this was not taken into consideration when I moved there, which had a great impact on my routine and led me to have suicidal thoughts. I have supported asylum seekers, refugees and those who have been trafficked over many years in London and now in Greater Manchester in my work as a GP. I have regularly been shocked and appalled by the shameful standard of accommodation provided by the Home Office at taxpayers' expense. Cramped conditions, no privacy or space to play, seems inhumane. Clients have been there for years, no security on site. One vulnerable female client's room was broken into and the lock was removed by the intruder. It took the building management team 4 weeks to replace the lock. She felt unsafe to stay in her room at that time, so she returned to rough sleeping. Housing look for reasons not to accommodate people. People with more complex needs are often given unsuitable offers of temporary accommodation, and when this does not work, it's held against them. People are set up to fail, and the system does not work, especially for those with more complex needs. Some clients have to share toilets and bathrooms, which are often unhygienic conditions with syringes and blood left in them. These are mixed for women to share with men, which is inappropriate. If a female client needs a toilet in the night, it's frightening walking through the corridors on her own. People report that they would have rather stayed on the streets, and the condition of the hostel impacts on their mental health. A family with young children from Syria were placed in a rat-infested house. The mother, an educated professional lady, told me that conditions in Aleppo at the height of the siege were only marginally worse than they were placed in. The elderly Pakistani lady who fled religious persecution, she was placed alone in a tower block flat far apart from her son. She did not speak English and had mobility issues. She spent long periods in isolation as her son was rarely able to visit, and she existed on food from the only corner shop that she could access. These are just a few examples of the responses from the call for evidence. As you can see, the current standards for some temporary accommodation is unsuitable for human habitation. The lack of quality, safe, secure housing the lack of support to access education, health and housing services, the lack of placements close to home, all impact the health and well-being of those living the reality of the homelessness system. Temporary accommodation is so much more than just the physical properties. The households in temporary accommodation, APPG, are calling on the government for a radical reform of temporary accommodation in the UK, starting with the current living standards and facilities that over 90,000 households and 124,000 children currently live in.